Thank you for watching. This is the artist talk for our current show, Geometric Aljamía, a Cultural Transliteration. We are joined by artists Rennie Gower, Julia Townsend, and Jorge Benitez, and they're going to tell you a little bit about this project, how it started, and talk about some of the works.
Great. While Morgan is walking around a little bit, I'll start. First, want to thank Morgan for hanging and installing the exhibition, and to Jacksonville State University for inviting us to have it on campus. And we're delighted just to give you a little more information about where it started and what it's been doing for the last 10 years, which is amazing that it's been going on for so long. So I'm Rennie Gower. I'm a professor emerita from Virginia Commonwealth University. And Jorge Benitez is a colleague of mine who is also recently retired from VCU. And Julia Townsend is one of the artists that we met when our project was launched in 2013. And we met her in the Middle East, in Doha, Qatar. And at that time, our campus, our university has a campus art school in Doha, Qatar, and they sponsor a design workshop every two years. And usually it was more designed for student participation, but in 2012, they opened it up to faculty, and we were invited to submit proposals about how to do hybrid making and to make connections across the globe between the East and the West. And Jorge and I had been interested in the patterning from two different perspectives, but we thought we could make a proposal together. And we were delighted when it was accepted, and that's how we went to Doha in the first place. And do you want to add anything to that, Jorge?
Well, the idea was almost a lark because we got very excited about the Tasmim workshops and exhibitions and lecture series, and I had already been to Doha, which is a wonderful city. So Rennie was invested in the patterns, and she was invested in multicultural art making, and I was really invested in Middle Eastern culture as well as European perspective. And that was the genesis, really.
Right. So when we proposed the project, we didn't know what we were going to get into. We didn't know who we would meet, but we knew we had to have some partners in Doha, and we worked with a physicist and our historian. And then we really went in just open-minded to who would show up. And Julia was teaching at the time at American University in Dubai. And she was aware of this conference from previous years and decided to come. And she joined us in our pop-up gallery workshop space. And a young woman from Kuwait, another a Moroccan Canadian were joining us as well. At one point, we thought we even would have someone from the royal family, but that didn't work out. But, Julia, do you want to talk about how you came to the conference a little bit?
Yeah, I had been in Dubai already a decade, I think. And prior to that, I lived in Istanbul. And so I was aware of these conferences they had, but it was kind of last minute. I said, well, what are they doing at this conference? And I read through the topics, and I read the description of this one, and I just said, I have to be there. And I rushed into my the head of the department, and I said, is it too late for me to get in a proposal to go to this conference? And he said, no, we can make it happen. So thankfully, many thanks to American University in Dubai, who made it possible for me to attend. It's about an hour away flight from Dubai, and I'd not been there. I'd been to other places around Oman and other places around the region. And I'm a painter, also an illustrator. I do some sculpture. But during my time in Istanbul, I'd spent 2 years studying the illumination of the Quran, the patterns that are in the border. It's called tezip, the same word they use in Farsi in Iran, and it's Tehzeeb. And it actually means gold illustrations. And I brought some of my notebooks from the course that I took at the Topkapi Palace, so you can see where I was coming from. I mean, here's just a random lesson. We were learning border patterns. This was just a class notebook. And we learned, let's find something here, how to do patterns on the corner.
Oh, wow.
Turning the corner with motifs.
Wow.
And I have more, but I'll just throw that. So I had done that 2002, something like that. I think I finished it in 2002, got to Dubai in 2003. So even though it's not my regular art interest, I do a lot of other things too. Definitely, I never looked at a pattern the same way twice after that. And this caught my eye because of the Southern Spanish, the geometric emphasis that you all were doing, whereas I came very much from this motif, the Ottoman tradition. So I was interested to see how you guys brought what you were doing from this very different approach from cutting paper, whereas there I was with the pencil. Both of us very analog traditions. As the world was getting more and more digital, there we are with our pencils and cutting knives.
Right, right. So the workshop actually was designed with 2 points of view. One was to help the participants develop motifs that could be tiled or tessellated. And you can see this is a piece by Julia where there's a motif that you think is the motif, but it really is the offset that forms the repetition. And then Jorge was using perspective as a way to examine. Well, maybe why don't you talk about how you're using perspective?
Yeah, I'd always been interested in perspective. And of course, perspective isn't really part of the 20th century modernist tradition, but it was interesting to think about it in a 21st century setting. So after the tragedy of September 11, I got very interested in what perspective meant in a Western context, but also being of Spanish descent and being aware of the Middle Eastern presence in Spain during the Middle Ages. I thought there's something weird going on here beyond the geopolitical and explanations of this tragedy. I thought this is really not in keeping with what actually happened hundreds of years ago when Europe was learning a great deal from the Arabs, and the exchange was to a large extent mutual. And all of them were rooted in the ancient Greeks who were rooted in the Babylonians. So there was a cosmopolitan feel to that era that went against the claims of all the participants in the September 11 episodes. So I thought, well, what does perspective mean to all this? We always think of it as uniquely European. And I started finding out that it did have a connection to the Arab world, and specifically to the way the Arabs had preserved Greek knowledge and the way they started exploring optics in the Middle Ages, and how the Italians ran with that, just like they ran with Indo-Arabic numerals. And so I became very interested in the exchange. And then I thought, well, what better way to express that exchange than to take Middle Eastern and specifically Islamic motifs and depict them in a quintessentially Western way. And that was the hybrid. And that's what Aljamia is, because Aljamia is the writing of Romance languages, actually any Western language, but in the case of Spain, specifically Spanish, occasionally Portuguese, I believe, using Arabic script.
Mm-hmm. Right, and my emphasis was really on the sacred geometry that's embedded in the Islamic tile patterns that you see just everywhere in the mosques. And it's used in screens and privacy screens and things like that. And my initial introduction to it was really through Celtic knotwork and Amish quilt designs and patterns. And I saw the universality that was embedded in this perfect geometry, circle, square, triangle, that's revealed in all of these different cultures. And it's really a universal language that allowed us to actually communicate in some cases with people who spoke very little English. And everyone seemed to understand what we were doing very intuitively. And instead of us actually being like the workshop leaders, we quickly turned into just a collaboration of like-minded artists and created an exhibition from our efforts from the workshop. These large ones right now, what we're looking at on the screen are my paper cuts. And they're based or inspired by their interlocking motifs of what you typically think of as Islamic tile patterns, but they're not replicating them. They're more like riffing off of them, and they're unique to me. And you couldn't like find them in a Islamic setting specifically. So, but there's a lot of math involved in some cases, and there's a lot of handwork, of course, with the tracing and the cutting, and that was very important that it was done by hand and not by a laser cutter. So what Julia did was very interesting, and you might like travel over to one of her pieces with the tracing. She envisioned her motif combined with a direct wall tracing. Not this particular one, but and that opened up another whole, there we go. That opened up another whole way of thinking about this. Do you want to talk about that, Julia? Julia, can you talk about how you came to that?
Yeah, first I want to say thank you to Morgan. This is no easy exhibit to install. There's drawing on the wall.
It was fun.
Even the pieces we just saw by Rennie. I mean, normally I'm sure you put in a nail and hang a picture, and if it's crooked, you straighten it. But, you know, with these works, they have to be totally right and even. So thank you very much, Morgan. I'm sure there was a team of people behind you.
Yes, lots of graduate students helped.
Great.
We'd love to hear from them. If they're passing, I'm in North Carolina, tell them to stop off sometime if they're in the area.
Absolutely.
But drawing on the wall, let's see, that was 2013. Yeah, 2 years before, a colleague of mine, Dr. Marcelo Lima, connected with a professor from Australia, and we started doing a series of drawing conferences, international drawing conferences. So for some of those that took place in Dubai, and we also had been doing wall drawings for that. So I sort of came to this conference having done experimental drawings, and people from England, from the Mediterranean had come, and everyone talking about all these, dare I say, wacky approaches to drawing. So it just seemed to me like, hey, let's use the wall, you know. So in that particular piece, the pattern in the middle, the diamond there right in the middle, is the pattern that's used as a trace for just flipping it all around it 9 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, I think, to extend the design onto the level of the wall. And it, you know, comes out different every time depending on how the wall is plastered or mudded or what have you. And then I made separate motifs for the bottom and the top, and that came right out of my, I mean, that's like a giant shemse, which means sun. That's the name of the motif that I'd learned in my training in Turkey. We did lots of those. That's a specific thing. That's often the cover of a Quran will have that design on it. And a tepelik, the top one, and then the bottom one. I think they often are the same. I think I made them look different. I think usually it's the same motif. And you might have little stuff drawn, sticking off the endings too. I think the first time I did it, I think I had little things going off, hand drawn on the wall and stuff.
Yeah, you had little dots.
Yeah, little dots coming out. That's a little modernist touch there. So.
Right. So, you know, we're so thrilled, Jorge and I, with how that just blossomed out, and we started thinking about that as a really integral part of the project. And while we were working in this space, it was a pop-up space that they created in their main hallway. It's called Saffron Hall. There was another workshop that was based on poetry, and they were told that they would have a space to exhibit their work. And when they were coming around to find that space, they picked around our space and saw what we were doing. And that group included 2 artists from Afghanistan, which is that piece there, and one of them. And they immediately wanted to join in, or at least to learn what we were doing. And we were just delighted to have them to join us and work through some pieces and add to the project. So this is one of the Afghans' tracings from a motif that he drew the motif overnight and cut it. And then because it was so complicated, we suggested that it would become a tracing as well. And he is a master calligrapher. The other artist, this piece, is a master woodworker. And you can kind of tell because this is very architectural and solid and almost heavy in some ways by comparison to the delicacy of the calligraphy. Then the Canadian, Moroccan-Canadian artist, she worked very mathematically and created a piece that's long and narrow. I haven't seen it yet, but
I think I saw it earlier.
She was very precise and methodical about it. This actually is another one from one of the Afghan artists. And Julia, you can talk about this too. It comes out of your connections to the drawing conference. You connected us with the artist from Australia, and then she invited us to have the show in Melbourne. And at that point, since it was going to travel more, I went back to the artist and asked them if they would like to add more pieces. Here's Hanani's piece. And they all pretty much wanted to. One artist, the Kuwaiti young woman from Kuwait, she didn't participate any further. She withdrew after the first showing. But Hanan sent her piece. The calligrapher from Afghanistan sent me 2 new motifs in the mail, and then with an assistant, I was able to create the cuttings from his new motifs in my studio. And then Julia, you made a new piece for that exhibition as well. And I think, Jorge, you also created new drawings.
I created new drawings, and of course, there's the sculptures.
The sculptures didn't get added though until we came back.
Yeah, no, that was later. That was not part of the original workshops, but they are now very much a part of the show, and their element is a little bit different because everything else is very reverential, and the sculptures are absurd. They're a lot of fun to look at, and they're made very seriously. I'm very earnest in the craftsmanship, but they are absurd, and they too tie in with the show. And this is something where I learned a valuable lesson with my Middle Eastern counterparts, because I had shown a slideshow of the sculptures, and I thought, oh my gosh, people might find them hurtful or offensive or something because they're obviously a little crazy. And what I discovered was a very positive response because they understood the satire, they understood the absurdity. And in a time as difficult as the one that the whole world is going through right now, and in a region that is really literally living under the gun in some cases, I discovered that my Middle Eastern colleagues not only had a great sense of humor, but a great sense of humor rooted in history. So they got the joke immediately.
Right. They are really funny when you can look at them up close.
Yeah, and they're
like a reliquary.
Satires. What's that?
A reliquary, what we're looking at right now.
In many respects, and really, what they're making fun of unrealistic expectations, and in a way saying, okay, folks, maybe if we all lightened up a little bit, we might get along a little better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So let's see, I'm trying to think where it went. I mean, we had an opportunity. I was contacted by a curator in Georgia, asking me to give them connections to colleagues I had in the Middle East, because they had an initiative that they had to focus on the Gulf region for an entire year at the university. And I says, well, I'd be happy to introduce you to people, but I think I have the show already in the bag that you might be interested in. And so then I proposed bringing this exhibition back to the United States after Julia had invited us back to Dubai, and we showed it in Dubai too, in Sharjah, based on all of her connections there. So it went from Doha to Australia to Dubai, and then it came back to the United States. And then once it was back here, it's been traveling quite extensively, pretty much coast to coast. And it's continuing on through 2 more years, I think. I can't wait. And let me think. We've had some issues a little bit where we actually have recut several of the paper cuts just because of the wear and tear. And so it still looks very fresh and new, even though it's been traveling for 10 years.
I was curious. I thought, wow, these have held up fantastically.
Well, most of them, yeah.
Yeah.
Some of them are the originals, and some of them aren't. So, I mean, we just do what we need to do to keep it going. Trying to think what else we want to say. So what was interesting, this is kind of backtracking a little bit, and it doesn't travel with the works anymore. But when we were in the original workshop, and theirs was headed up by a former colleague of ours called Susan Scholl, and she was a theater person, and she was trying to unpack what the Qatar voice was, and they wrote poetry, and then in her workshop, and then she recited the poetry, and they were supposed to have a venue for that, and when that didn't happen, because everything was pretty fluid, we invited them into our space to do the readings. And so Susan read these incredible poems, and by serendipity, Jorge got access to a guitar, and he created musical riffs to accompany her reading the poems. And so it was a complete sort of convergence of just so many things that it was terribly exciting. Highly well received. And we do have the recordings that we redid when we returned to the States. So I think they're in the press. The press. I can get them to you, Morgan, if you want to see.
Absolutely. I'd love to see that.
Okay. So it continues to resonate with folks, I think, because of the universal nature of the sacred geometry, and it's a very uplifting, sort of inclusive and reflective and contemplative, optimistic look at the two cultures coming together, and I think that's an important thing. And I think maybe that's why it has the longevity that it has to this date.
It is truly incredible. I did have one question. How did you guys decide on the colors to put behind these?
Well, for mine, I mean, the color's not showing up so well in the video, but for mine, I was looking really at the ceramic glazes on the tiles that are in the original Islamic motifs that I was being inspired by. And so it's like iron ore, cobalt, and sort of a very rich dark green. Can't remember what that one comes out of. One's copper.
Cobalt and malachite.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember how they made that glaze. But anyway, those are very typical colors that you'll see in the Islamic tile work, and they have to be fairly intense colors for it to do the reflection that it's doing. So the pieces are obviously installed. Well, that's not obvious, but they're floating off the wall about 1.5 inches, and then the color is painted on the back of the piece. And then that color bounces off the wall and then back through the cut work. So the front of the piece is the pristine virgin white paper. And so when you see that, like in this case, the cobalt hue in the shadow or coming back through, that's the reflective color on the reverse side, hitting the white wall and then just kind of floating back up forward. So that's how I did it. And Julia, you picked that neon yellow.
Yeah,
Where did that come from?
I think that came because you hadn't used any yellow. I thought I'd do something different, and I happen to have some very strong yellow, which I thought would work great for this. So,
I want to add something about the color because Rennie mentioned the performance.
Yeah.
And on opening night when we had the performance, Susan was standing in front of Rennie's pieces. And it was the time of day when we were getting a beautiful late afternoon blast of desert light. And so Rennie's pieces started to glow just as the performance was going on. So it was an amazing moment. And I've never seen such a happy audience in my life as we had that evening. But it was the visual, it was the language, it was the music, everything came together at once.
Yeah, it was very, very moving. And it was very rewarding that people would come into our little pop-up space and just want to hang out with us because, you know, we were installing things as we were making them. And it just turned into a space that it was public. It was a public space, but then it became a very sort of private, sort of quiet space. And, you know, people really were drawn to it. And my work is about all that anyway, trying to create these private moments within public spheres. And so I was just delighted when it worked across the board. It didn't matter who the people were or what they were doing. They automatically came in, got a smile on their face, calmed down. You know, it was great.
This is a very calm show.
Well, that's part of what we were trying to do. There's also, you know, a bit of an undercurrent, you know, I think when you are drawn in, and particularly through Jorge's work, when you get the little bit of the twist coming through with the imagery. And so it has a nice, I think, has a really good balance of sort of you know, I don't want to say it's like good and evil or, you know, light and dark or, but, you know, it's not all fluffy.
Well, and for me, I think Julia really understands this, having lived in Istanbul. But I come from Latin America, and all over Latin America, there are what we would consider Arab and Islamic motifs in what are predominantly Catholic cultures, and that goes back to the fact that the Spanish brought these things over, which they had gotten from the time that the Muslims were in Spain. They were there for 700 years. So Rennie and I were speaking with a colleague who actually was Swedish, and he was telling us, this is when we were making the proposal, that his ancestors dealt with the Arabs through trade. So the Vikings were dealing with these cultures also. So I think in the US today, and this goes to the heart of what Rennie's saying about the positive and optimistic aspects, we tend to look at things in an isolated way, and we tend to look at culture as something that is separate and from all cultures separate from one another. But in reality, East and West never really existed until recent times. They were in contact with one another constantly and exchanging ideas. And this show doesn't address that consciously, but we were all aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I might add something about pattern, which in my education anyway, sometimes pattern is preceded by the word just, like, oh, it's just a pattern, or it's surface ornament. and it's sort of relegated to a second level of importance. It's not representational, it's just an ornament. And so during my studies, the whole idea of this pattern is, it refers to the infinity of God. That's the sort of the idea of why you see it throughout a mosque. Never ending, patterns never end. And one thing that I just find fascinating is there is something in our wiring. We respond to a pattern, a repetition. You can make a square, you can take one square of one of Rennie's huge wall pieces, and you're like, oh, that's nice. Maybe that's my napkin design or something. But then you fold it over, you flip it, and once it starts continuing, it triggers some sort of response, aesthetic response in the mind. It becomes an entirely different piece. And I even experienced this. I've the last year I've opened a frame shop, so I make frames. So I cut I cut two pieces that are the same. Then I cut two pieces that are the same. I glue two together. And then the next morning I get up and I bring the two of those together, and it's an entirely different thing once it joins together. It's so simple. Absolutely. But it's just, we have the way the brain works when things touch, when they unite, when you see. And then I confess, while working last night, I was listening to a documentary about boy bands, like NSYNC, and what was that other one? I forget. And they were talking about how they have 5 boys in the band. And if you just have one guy jumping around up on the stage, it's nice. But if you get 5 boys jumping around, all doing the same thing, it's a completely different show. This idea, something about our human mind and repetition, it creates an entirely different human response.
Well, what Julia is saying actually we talked about it in Doha because we collaborated with a gentleman who was a physicist who taught at the school. He was a Jordanian physicist, and he lectured with us when we did the lecture component of the workshop, and he talked about patterns and fractals and how all of that connected with modern physics as well as ancient traditions. And he was talking about it in a very universal way. It wasn't unique to one culture or another. It was just, as Julia was saying, it's part of how we're wired throughout.
Right. It's the ratios of the universe,
Yeah.
It's like the Fibonacci sequence. Bodies.
Oh, I think Rainy
macro to the micro.
For a second.
Say that again.
Oh, you froze for a second. The last thing we heard was Fibonacci sequence.
Oh, I'm saying the ratios are embedded in our bodies from micro level down to the nanoparticle that we learned from the physicists, out to the macro, which is infinity and beyond, and like Julia said, it is the sacred geometry, is representative of infinity, of perfection, of God, of continuity, and so, but that's why it's universal, because we all recognize those ratios, and we intuitively come to the same conclusions about them. And it's more complicated than you can describe simply, but it's the foundation of mathematics, quantum physics, all of it. Where am I going? But that's what's fascinating to me about it. And, finding the references to these patterns, no matter where you go in the world, you find similar uses of the motifs, different in some cases, but basically they come down to very similar uses and meanings. And I find that reassuring that, we do share 99% DNA similarities.
Right.
But anyway, it's been a very rewarding project to work on. It really has been a work in progress, because like every time it travels someplace new, we reinvent it and add things or redo things or have new conversations like we're doing today.
Yeah.
New configurations, new things installed next to something that we haven't seen before.
Yes.
And,
I
I think you had that.
Also.
You had that pounced piece on the wall. Did you actually start pouncing it? That was Julia's idea.
Oh yes, I did start. I will show it in progress.
Okay, so
Oh,
you
wow.
are. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh.
That looks great.
Yeah.
Yeah. It will be finished this afternoon. So, but yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah. Well, that never occurred to me. Julia invented that when the show was in Sharjah. That was her idea as well.
That's a Renaissance technique,
Yes.
because they would take the cutter like a pattern cutter for with the holes, and that's how they would draw lines. The fresco painters on the walls.
That's right.
Right.
Pouncing.
That's incredible. So it's really very we're talking about calm and relaxing. Doing the tracings and putting this show up was very calming, I feel like.
Well, that's good. I'm glad it didn't like stress you out.
Tracing all the patterns was very therapeutic.
Great. Well, we can't thank you enough for hosting it and for all the work you've done to put it up. It looks fantastic.
Thank
I
you.
wish we could have come like we had planned, but COVID is a problem.
Absolutely. But I'll get photographs of it for you all.
Thank you. I just want to say your gallery really looks great. It
does.
Immaculate. It's
Thank
beautifully
you.
done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Well, we are thankful and excited to have this show here. Our students are very excited to come see it. They've been sneaking in while I've been putting it up this week.
Well, that's great.
Nice.
Yeah, if they have questions, just have them reach out. You have our email addresses.
Absolutely. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great. Looks really good.
Thank you.